Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here in Long Beach, California, where we're visiting with Virgin Orbit, an independent company within the Virgin family of companies founded by Sir Richard Branson in part of his drive, three-pronged drive to expand into the space industry. One part of it, originally all the companies were part of the Virgin Galactic family to get into human spaceflight, small satellite launch, as well as advanced aerospace manufacturing. And we're sitting here with Dan Hart, the CEO of Virgin Orbit, now an independent company as part of the Virgin family of companies. You're the CEO here. You had more than 3 decades, since 1983, at Boeing, and a variety of jobs, including on the space side of things, and now you're leading 390 or so people here to revolutionize the entire small satellite launch business. Thanks very much for hosting us today.
Well, great to be with you this morning.
So you and I saw each other in Washington, and you were generous enough to extend an invitation for us to visit while we're out here on the West Coast. You guys are in an incredibly competitive segment of the market. Orbital ATK has been in this business for 26 years, doing an airdrop launch similar to the approach you have, which is to use Cosmic Girl, the modified 747, in order to drop the LauncherOne, which is powered by your Newton 3 or 4 motor, and so get payloads up to about 300 kilograms into like a polar orbit, I guess about 500-mile altitude or so, or launch a whole bunch of much smaller satellites. But it is a very competitive marketplace. Orbital ATK has been in it for about 25 years of the similar sort of launch approach. You have Israel Aerospace Industries in it. You have Rocket Labs in it, Vector Space, Massey. Talk to us a little bit about what differentiates you guys, what gives you guys the edge in this crowded market space.
First of all, it's a market that is growing significantly and really started to take off in recent years, over the last, say, 5 years. So it's a market that certainly had at various levels of activity over the last couple of decades or more, but really technology in electronics, in electric propulsion, in laser communications, and phased array technologies has given it a ramp that has never been seen before over the last few years. And so just in perspective, it's really present day that's driving. That said, so who's going to be advantaged in this market? It's going to be those people who can drive to a low cost, who can drive to give services to this part of the sector that others cannot. And what we're doing is we are making the simplest rocket we can, and using state-of-the-art technologies in composites, in engine technologies, in electronics technologies to do that. And we're using an aircraft to help us on the way. And so the aircraft helps us to give that initial boost. It's the most reusable first stage in existence. And it helps to simplify the rocket, both in terms of its structure, its electronics, and to some extent its propulsion. And it also gives us unprecedented flexibility to where we can fly essentially any inclination and take off from all over the world. And so those features will be our advantage. And I applaud those who sort of came before us and plowed the trail of small launch. We're now taking that start, and we're taking it to the next level.
Bring us up to speed on where you guys are now in the process. The jet is out on the ramp right behind your facility here at Long Beach Airport. There's an enormous amount of work there. You have a full-up rocket that's configured. There are parts of a whole number of other launch vehicles that you have inside the plant. Sadly, we couldn't take our cameras in there to take a look. Bring us up to speed on where you guys are, because I know you're going to have the first launch this year, but give us a little bit of clarity, where you are on the process and when we should expect to see that first launch.
So we're targeting the first launch about the middle of the year. We're in the qualification stage where we're doing our final checkouts of our structures, of our vibrating the electronics, checking out the engines, and taking them through their paces and temperatures and pressures. we're in flight test of our aircraft. And so we're right in that formative stage. We've now been through a full integration and checkout of a rocket, and so we just finished taking a rocket through launch with all of our launch equipment, with our launch crew, with all of our launch procedures. And we've gone through a few cycles of that with the propellants going from the ground to the vehicle and a simulated flyout. So we're right in that integration phase. As you walk through the factory, you see a lot of activity, a lot of energy as we're line of sight to launch.
And you guys want to get to 24 a year, which is what your goal is. Talk to us about how you're going to ramp to that, and at what point do you think you guys get to that? Because you're shooting for very fast cycle. I mean, you're on the record saying that if, once somebody puts us on contract in 6 months, we're going to be able to put a spacecraft up. Right now, your Newton production line is closer to about sort of 10 months for each engine. So, I know you guys are working through that challenge, and I want to talk to you about digital, the additive plus subtractive design and how that's going to get you there to a much faster cycle. But walk us through what that ramp looks like. When you get to the half dozen, when are you going to get to a dozen? When do you think you'll be up at that 24?
Yeah, no, we're somewhat unique in that as a startup, our rocket is not a one-of-a-kind experiment, but we've set up a factory capable of production now. So as you walk through our factory, you'll see about 5 ship sets of rocket in various stages of assembly today. Our philosophy is to be hardware rich. And that's something that has actually rarely been done in the rocket world, is to go ahead and lean in to the market so that you can have the hardware and take advantage of success, or if you have an issue, be able to react quickly to it and resolve it. So we're a production facility today. We're building this year about 6 rockets, and we plan to build 12 next year, and we plan to ramp up and launch 24 the next, and we are capitalized to do that.
And where are you customer-wise at this point? Is the first launch, for example, well, the first launch I think is going to have one of your test payloads.
It's only, yeah, first launch is us.
First launch is all you. But talk to us, who's your first customer, and what are some other customers? How many of these launches at this point do you have actually booked and on contract?
So we have a full manifest for 18, where we plan on flying 4 commercial customers, including NASA, including the DoD through DIUX, and a couple of commercial customers. We have about 2/3 of 2019 now sold, and that's where we want to launch once a month. And we have agreements for about half the launches for 2020, where we want to launch, fly 24 times. So we're seeing pull from the market. There is a bit of a bottleneck right now in launch, and we are poised to help open that.
I was going to ask, you have it was really an extraordinary tour of the factory. As I mentioned, I'm very sorry that we couldn't get our cameras in there, where you guys are really doing everything in-house. I mean, it is completely vertically integrated, from the circuit boards you guys produce to the machining of the thrust chambers and the wiring harness. I mean, everything about it. You're spinning your own tanks. You have your own test equipment that you guys set up, which is amazing. We saw the oh God, what was it called? The Prime,
Pylonotron Prime.
Excuse me.
Oh.
We saw Pylonotron Prime that's been retired, and now apparently you have AT-AT or the AT-AT that is the new dynamic test vehicle for you guys to practice separation, stress loads on the rocket when it's on the airplane, which is an impressive structure. Do you think that that's what gives you guys a competitive edge, that you do everything in-house?
It's one of the things. When you do have a lot of verticality in your factory, the amount of knowledge that you have in your engineering and operations workforce just is enormous, and so we have huge depth in this team, and that allows us to drive fairly quickly and respond very quickly. In that we don't have to have, we have an issue, we don't have to spend the next 10 days figuring out how to do a subcontract modification, because it's us. It's, if an issue pops up in the morning, we can often get around it and resolve it by the evening.
Is that, how would you I mean, you came from Boeing, giant company, very defined culture as a 100-year-old concern, some good cultural attributes, maybe some not as good cultural attributes, a little more bureaucratic, as we remember. Chris Chadwick and I think Leanne Corrett now are working to reduce the bureaucracy and to get that agility into the company. Talk to us a little bit about the culture, you guys. I mean, I have a whole bunch of market questions, but I wanted to get to the cultural element of it. You know, on the wall, you guys have "screw it, just do it," which is something that Sir Richard is fond of saying, and it really is, you know, kind of a great motto. Talk to us a little bit about the culture you guys have here of innovation. You know, as you said, and you know, Will Pomerantz was taking us around the factory and talked about the number of times when folks have come into this process and said, "Hey guys, wait a minute, you know, if we do something this way, we may give up a little bit of performance, but we're going to be able to reduce cost by X or speed time by Y." Talk to us a little bit about that culture.
So number one, I'll describe the team a little bit. You know, we are a mix of people like me who grew up in large aerospace and performed, you know, worked on rockets and satellites and things like that. People who spent some time in new space companies, and you know, some people who actually have both, who went from the Lockheed Martins and Boeings of the world and went to new space for a while. And then we have people from other industries who have a totally different perspective, and we have a fair amount of new folks to the industry who are learning about rockets and about how to do things. So we're a nice mix, and I like to think of us as really, number one, balancing and keeping a nice freedom to innovate. So, you know, number one in this company has been the ability to bring up new ideas and have them decided upon and adopted quickly. And number two, there is a lot of experience. If you look at our ranks, I mean, there are people who have worked on and built rockets like the Delta, the Atlas, the Falcon, and others. And have experience with those. And so the processes that they understand and worked, they understand. And then we spend a lot of time thinking about, well, what's the meat of that? What's the core of that method or that process? And what's the other stuff that has gathered along the way, along the years, that maybe isn't necessary? And so we apply the meat and the core, and we try to avoid some of the extra overhead. And I think that's really the mix. That's the recipe that works for us.
How large do you estimate this market is, and how much of a percentage of it are you trying to carve out for? You know, do you guys have a plan for, I'm going to have 10% of the market, or 12%, or 15% of the market? Talk to us a little bit about what the size of this market is from your guys' projection. And how big of a piece of it that you guys have?
You know, the estimates that we've seen of the market, just in terms of growth, have it growing on the order of 5 times over the next 10 years from the last 10 years.
Over the past couple of years, the launch market for small satellites has grown from a handful here and there to hundreds of satellites per year. Looking ahead, basically every study out there finds that over the next decade, the market will grow by a factor of 5 or more, growing from about 800 launched during the last decade to over 3,600 in the next 10 years. Conversations we've had with customers who are signing launch contracts today show us that those growth curves are realistic and maybe even conservative.
So we see, if we look at launches, we see the tempo of launches going up considerably. And then the other thing is, the other important dynamic is that this customer class has settled in the past for being sort of extra payload, extra baggage on larger rockets in the past. And what we're seeing is now these satellites they're not experiments, but they're forming important business plans that require schedules, require their own orbits. And so if you look at the whole dynamic, we see a shift from some of the extra payload accommodations from large rockets to smaller rockets are happening. And we see a growth in number of satellites, and all that translates into a lot of business for rockets like ours. Now, we don't anticipate, we're not going to be alone in this market space, and we welcome our competitors into it, because a new industry, a new market needs to have multiple players. We think that our flexibility and accompanied with our price point will give us a substantial market share, and it will slowly go up as we get operational.
Do you, much has been made about the friendship between Sir Richard and Elon Musk being good buddies, but they're good buddies because they're not necessarily in the same business now. At some point, anybody who gets good, even though you say I'm going to be really good at, and I'm going to focus on the small satellite part of the market, at some point you're going to build and keep improving steadily your capability. Where is it in your plan to start moving up that food chain once you demonstrate that you're, killing it at 24 a year? Do you see yourself moving up that?
That's a possibility that we talk about. I mean, our focus right now is so heavily towards flying and ramping up production for the small satellites. And there are different flavors of small satellites. I mean, we are currently serving the 300 to 500 kilogram satellites, depending upon the inclination. There are some larger satellites. There are also some different multi-manifest combinations that could have us grow. Generally speaking, though, if we think about what Elon is doing, what Blue Origin is doing, they're really focused on large rockets with a cause of driving humanity to other worlds. And Richard's focus really is putting capability in space to help life on Earth. And so there's a bit of a philosophical difference in purpose that will probably, make it not a head-to-head competition for any time in the foreseeable future, because the purpose is different.
Talk to us about risk management. You guys want to, take a certain degree of risk, do things differently. It's a very conservative business, sometimes for good reason, because there's a lot riding on it. How are you balancing that sort of the risk model between taking appropriate risk but not taking too much risk?
I would say that we have a fairly traditional view of how to mitigate risk and how to assess it. The difference that we have is through empowerment of our employees, we can turn the assessment and the mitigation quickly. And it's all about driving small teams of incredibly capable people who are self-managed through processes. And then where we have the key touch points to chief engineers and boards, we certainly do that, but we really try to drive empowerment down to the lowest level. And frankly, we do it, it's in our DNA to do it. A lot of the large companies they have the same mantra, but it's just a little further putt for them.
What from your Boeing experience is very valuable here? What from your Boeing experience is less valuable here, and that you're learning and iterating and advancing with your team as you're building this new culture?
So, first of all, at Boeing, I had a wonderful experience over some, the greatest programs in recent space history, and I will always be grateful for that. I learned the trade through there. So I learned what worked in terms of decision making and technical risk management and innovation, and I learned what was difficult. It's always difficult for large companies, especially in production, to generate innovation, and often companies will separate the innovation engine from the production engine to get it done. Certainly Boeing does that with their Phantom Works, Lockheed Martin with their Skunk Works. I mean, that's famous. So those lessons about how to drive into production and the disciplines that are needed for that, and how to preserve an innovative environment have been invaluable for me here.
And you work for one of the most iconic people in the aerospace and aviation business, Sir Richard Branson. What's he like as a boss? Because he's demanding, because he's been growing into a number of market fields from cell phones to aviation. What's he like as a boss?
You know, it's been terrific working for Sir Richard. You know, number one, the vision and what he's trying to do on this planet is inspiring. And so what that does to get me out of bed in the morning, what it does to get the rest of the team inspired, it goes a long way in a hard day to have somebody pulling in that direction. Number two, when a good idea comes up along the team, and I happen to mention it to him or his leadership team, usually the feedback is, well, when are you going to be doing that? Pretty much instantly, where there's very little gnashing of teeth and meetings and considerations, and so yeah, the response is immediate and quick. The other thing that I get from Sir Richard often is questions about what's in the art of the possible, and so he's always pulling us to think about the next chapter, the next step, what's possible, and that's an inspiring environment to work in. Again, for me and the leadership team and everybody in the company.
Dan, it was a pleasure spending time with you. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks for giving us a couple of extra minutes. We really appreciate it and look forward to continuing the dialogue.
Well, great talking with you.